Hello, so my name's Ken Church, and I'll be moderating session 4 on the future. We have a bunch of really amazing speakers here, and the purpose of this moderation is to get the audience to be engaged with these speakers and to have the speakers engage the questions. The talks are actually pre-recorded, and we're probably not going to spend too much time on that now, hopefully. So let me try to introduce each of the speakers one by one. It's a great pleasure to have Dave Ferrucci here. He's probably best known for some work that he did at IBM on the Jeopardy program. It was an amazing accomplishment. Um, but I think he doesn't want to talk about the past. I think he's going to talk about the future, and that what I think he's quite concerned about is whether we're being ambitious enough or not. We tend to think that question answering means something like returning a span, a substring of a document, and often we give the system the document so they don't even have to find that. All they have to do is find the substring. And we think that it's really magic when that kind of squad answering just works. But I think he's going to say that we're not being ambitious enough or rigorous enough, and that returning substring is probably far from comprehension. So as I said, I think he's going to go try to push us beyond squad. Maybe if I was to give him a softball, I might say, I think there's a lot of people in the audience who probably think that BERT and other such similar systems have pretty much solved all these problems. And I'd like to hear from Dave what's wrong with that view. So Ito is going to be trying to push us out of our comfort zone. So I think we're all too comfortable right now with the transformers. And I think what Ito's going to argue is that the benchmarking practices haven't changed things much. We're often addressing the same old tasks, the same old apps, and that while we're doing a little better on the same old, and maybe performance is going up, are we doing as well as we think? And are the old goals, how are we doing on the old goals, that is really deeply trying to understand things or to do profound language technology? So I see a lot of synergies here between what Ito's talking about and what Dave's talking about. And Ito will try to argue that we need to have more emphasis of realistic use cases, realistic expectations, maybe more humility. We're not doing quite as well as we think we are. And that all the effort on system test and end-to-end stuff makes it really hard to understand how well we're doing on each of the pieces. And that while the performance looks pretty good compared to what we used to do on the same old problems, it's kind of hard to really see an accurate picture of how we're doing on things that really matter. And maybe more effort on unit test and more effort on modularity and representation would give us more insight into where we could be better and where we have opportunities for improvement. And we have a submitted talk that actually does a really deep dive into all kinds of realistic setting questions and all kinds of metrics. So for settings, the use case matters. Dictation is totally different from call centers, and both of those are totally different than trying to put captions on movies. The latency issue really became real for me when I regularly attend meetings in China and I don't speak Chinese. I'm using the technology to keep up with the meetings, and the technology is always getting better, but one of the problems was the metrics. At first, it was all designed to do well on translation. They really care about BLEU scores. And I said, no, we need to worry about latency. And the example I gave them was that I was at a meeting and everybody was clapping. And when they were all done clapping, the system told me why they were clapping, that the speaker had asked them to applaud. And so they did, but it was a little late for me now. So now there's all this energy on simultaneous interpretation, and that's great. But another problem is throughput. And people think that latency is the same as throughput, but in fact, it turns out that it takes longer to translate the Chinese to English than it does to say the Chinese. So after an hour or so, I'm always a couple sentences behind. And even if the latency is pretty good, the throughput isn't good enough. It's really important to delete stuff. So when I have a real interpreter there helping me, a human interpreter, I, I I know they can tell me what I need to know when I need to know it, and I'm much more engaged in the meeting. This submitted talk is going to talk about a lot of other cases where the setting matters, speaking rate matters, recording conditions, codecs. We used to worry about things like packet loss, but having a crappy compressor, I've had to deal with that. That can make things really hard. And it's quite realistic, actually. I applaud all of that. The metrics also need to be tailored to the use case. So we talk about word error rate as if that's all that matters. It's kind of like, blue being all that matters. But in fact, some errors are worse than others. Some are downright misleading or offensive or politically sensitive. And some would be hard to detect, like exactly how do you transcribe a filled pause? Do we care? So we really do need diagnostics that would help us understand the answer to Mayor Koch's question, how am I doing? Or to help us prioritize what needs to be fixed when. Uh, Forced alignment is one kind of task which is really useful for downstream research on things like prosody. I'd like to know exactly which phonemes were spoken when and how much change in pitch and duration do you do when you're emphasizing this or contrasting with that. Um, Diarizations, who spoke when. It's really, really difficult to make sense of a transcript if you don't know who's speaking. Uh, uh, and there are great demonstrations of that. Demographics obviously matter. Children don't speak like adults, men don't speak like women, um, and people from one region don't speak like people from another region. And if we're really serious about serious products, we need to take these issues very seriously. And this talk really does a great job of calling out some of those issues, or many of them. Um, that sort of segues into another talk, which sort of says context matters. So one kind of question would be, it's good enough to do really well on the leaderboards, but some of the models are using just massive amounts of resources. And can we compare solutions using similar amounts of resources? And that gets to be really tricky how to describe that exactly. But I think the next talk will try to get into that as well. Also, sort of time matters. So the right answer at one point in time is not going to be the right answer another point in time. And there's lots of other factors that matter. You would want to. It's useful to know who the audience is, and even personalizing. So web search is often personalized, and map search, localized search is different. So if you wanted to know where's the nearest bar or where's the nearest restaurant, it kind of depends on where you are, kind of obviously, but lots of questions depend on where you are. And so this gets into all kinds of opportunities for interdisciplinary work. The first set of questions, like resources, sort of sounds like systems research, and the last set of questions sounds like web search. And I'd really like to see more of this kind of interdisciplinary work. Greg is going to tell us about what's going on with MLPerf or ML Commons. Uh, and this is a very serious effort by a whole lot of companies, mostly, some universities, to really try to get at some of those context questions that were mentioned in the previous talk. And they have a lot of advice to give us about how to think about benchmarking. They've really thought about a lot of these issues quite deeply, and we should really know more about what's going on in that community. Um, and then Sam is going to tell us about how everything's broken, but we can fix it. Um, and I think one of the problems is that a lot of the problems were mentioned in the previous talks are all going to come up with, but I think he's also going to try to highlight how there's little room for researchers to demonstrate improvements. And so we'd like to see some things that would address that. One of the concerns is that some of the work on sort of adversarial constructions kind of obscures what we're trying to measure. And so I don't think he's that happy with that approach. What he's advocating are things like validity and reliability, stuff that sounds a lot like uh, experimental psychology from the 1950s. I'll get back to that in a minute. Um, so he talks about what it would take to restore a healthy evaluation ecosystem. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. So finally, I'd like to sketch out some questions that maybe we'll discuss during the Zoom call. For Dave, give him a softball. What's wrong with the stuff that this community is using? And for Ito and a couple of the other talks, you make an excellent case for being realistic about the settings and expectations. I often hear people in our field talk about the benchmarks, and they even use terms that sort of imply that the benchmarks are real world applications. I'm wondering what we can do to disavow these students of this kind of perspective, of this perspective. What can we do to get people to really be much more concerned with the real world as it really is? And now a question for Ansel and Greg. I thought you made a great case for more interdisciplinary collaboration. Can you say more about the collaborations you're involved in and collaborations you'd like to be involved in? And finally, for Sam, I was thinking that a lot of the things he was bringing up sound reminiscent of the kinds of things my father used to talk about in experimental psychology. He was at Harvard when Skinner was there and worked on behaviorism for his whole career. That's really a very empirical approach to the world. A lot of those ideas seem to be relevant again. He would teach classes on experimental design. I'm wondering if there are things that we can learn in our community from what was known back then. Thank you. Anyway, let's have a great Zoom call. Take care. Bye.